Hey everyone, this is Mike from the Comic Book Trove, back today with another Omnibus review, and today I'm going to be taking a look at the Batman Knightfall Omnibus Volume 3, and this is the Knightsend part of the story, the concluding chapter, you could say. I have already previously looked at Volumes 1 and 2 on the channel, so you can feel free to go back and check those out if you're interested. But today we're going to take a look at the third volume. We're going to see how the whole thing wraps up and what that's like, really. So, well, first thing I'll just point out here is the dust jacket, like with volumes 1 and 2. It's a Kelly Jones cover, a bit of original artwork that he did for this omnibus specifically. Now, I'm not really a fan of these dust jackets for these omnibus. I have to say they're just not quite my thing. I think the anatomy of the characters that Kelly Jones draws here, it just looks quite weird. But volume 2 is the worst one, I think. I don't mind this one so much. I don't mind the first volume. I don't know what was going on with that second volume, but it just, yeah, not good. But the spine, again, you know, the issue that I have really more so than anything with these dust jackets for the trilogy of Omnis is just the bizarre spine choice and how weird they look on the shelf next to each other and amongst other omnibus. They just look completely weird. They stand out and not really in a good way. But at the end of the day, it's just a dust jacket. Nice little tongue twister there. And it doesn't matter too much, obviously. We're focusing on what's in the book. That's the main thing. That's what's most important. Speaking of which, we'll move into it now, and I will just give a spoiler warning here, just in case, really, because I'm going to cover some plot points and summarise some stuff. At the end of the second volume, then, we had the return of Bruce Wayne, but his quick discovery that, following on from his time spent injured from what Bane did to him back in Volume 1, he is not fully quite himself yet. He's not got all of his strength and skill that he previously had, meaning he's not yet able to just put Azrael down, just swiftly defeat him and take back the mantle of Batman. He's going to have to train and regain that skill that he's lost, and that's exactly what he starts doing here. And I do like the fact that when Bruce Wayne returns, magically, literally kind of magically, from his injuries, he's not immediately awesome again. It's quite good. It injects a bit of realism, I suppose, as much as you could say it's realistic, into things, you know, and the fact that he's got to work hard and regain what he's lost, effectively. You know, he's got to regain his skills, his strength, his abilities to enable him to take down Azrael, who is pretty good at this point. You know, he's established himself as Batman, and he's a tough opponent. And Azrael at this point has now pretty much moved firmly into being the villain of the story, and that's really, I suppose, what the transition was about in Volume 2, is watching Azrael kind of descend slowly further and further into becoming far more of a villain than a hero. And as of this point in this book, Azrael's completely off the deep end. His costume is looking, you know, the most 90s extreme that it looks. There's kind of, you know, a bit of, I suppose, symbolism in a way. Is that the more kind of, I suppose, dark, you could say, the more kind of dark and twisted Azrael gets in his views and his actions, the more his costume changes and the more spiky and weird it starts looking. And at this point, as you can see, it's gone pretty extreme. So you've got Bruce Wayne training with these sorts of ninjas, all working for Lady Shiva, who's a kind of deadly assassin type person. She has agreed to work with Bruce and retrain him. Azrael, you know, the story is still cutting back to him fairly frequently, just to reassure us that he still needs to be defeated. You know, he's still out there and he's still not doing a good job. He's not a good Batman. Nightwing also starts to come into the story more from this point, having been mostly absent and doing his own thing, but now he comes in and gets involved. Starts to help out, you know, with Robin. He starts learning more about what's been going on, basically, because he wasn't fully aware of all the details of this stuff, and he's been away from the Batcave and from the whole Batman thing for a while. So it's cool to see him come back in. I think Nightwing's a really good character. And what you get then, the first kind of major thing, the first real point, I suppose, the main event in the book is the the big fight, the big event, the showdown between Bruce Wayne returning as Batman and Azrael. And that starts to happen, I think, around about here. Pretty sure. Yeah. So this is where Bruce Wayne's come back. He's donning the bat suit for the first time. And from this point on, he kind of heads into action to take on Azrael. And this fight that ensues here between him and Azrael, it lasts a while. Okay, it runs over several issues, all collected in here, of course. I think it runs about 4 or 5 issues all in all. Starting here, nice splash page to begin the confrontation. That's in an issue of Catwoman, actually. So that's Jim Ballant artwork, very nice. And then it really starts here with Batman issue 510. Pretty exciting fight sequence, I've got to say. I actually, for the most part, really enjoyed this when I was reading through it. And you've got, again, sort of Robin and Nightwing kind of pursuing the fight. They end up getting involved a little bit as well. There's a bit where I think Nightwing ends up fighting Azrael. But it's just like one of those sorts of epic action sequences where it's like a superhero fight that's ends up covering half of Gotham City in terms of the distance of it. They're punching each other all over the place. They end up fighting on this bridge. Lots of explosions, lots of fires. It's all very 90s, really. Nothing subtle about it whatsoever. But I suppose it's quite cathartic because, especially if you've read through all these Omnis up to this point, you read through all of Volume 2, and I tell you, for most of that book, you're just thinking to yourself, like, let's just get the real Batman back now. So it is quite good to get this sequence here where finally, it starts to happen. There is this weird bit, I can't remember exactly why, but Azrael's costume, the Azbat costume, it goes from being kind of blue or black, whatever it's meant to be, to red. It starts being bright red here. I think there is some reason for it, but it's quite interesting. I don't really mind. It's quite visually interesting, but it was a bit weird. And then the fight comes back to Wayne Manor and into the Batcave, which I suppose kind of mirrors the fight with Bane, really, like where Batman, Bruce Wayne, I mean, his downfall was in the manor when Bane confronted him there, and Bruce got his ass kicked. And then here, it's kind of the opposite. So Bruce is waiting for Azrael. When he comes back, they have a final fight here. And this time Bruce emerges victorious and therefore can reclaim being Batman. The actual ending, the final defeat of Azrael, is maybe a little bit anticlimactic. I actually think it's quite good, but it's not a case of like Batman just punching him down and physically defeating him. He kind of outsmarts him, so Bruce uses his greater knowledge of the cave system to force Azrael to kind of crawl through these narrow caverns, and then he confronts him and literally blinds him with light at one of the entrances of the cave. And that kind of shock of that harsh light hitting him, it kind of brings Azrael back to his senses in a way. Forces him to realise that he's not Batman, and he needs to give it back. It's one of those. I can see it. I can see people liking it or disliking it. It's maybe not quite the end for that character that you want to see. Not that it's really the end of the character. Azrael does not just go away at this point. He still turns up. He turns up in this book again. But obviously, that's the end of him as Batman. That's the end of the Azbat era. And then Bruce Wayne is back, but only briefly, because then there's a really interesting bit in the second half of this omnibus, because at this point, effectively, Knightsend and Knightfall as a whole, therefore, is finished. With Azrael's defeat, that's the end of the main event. But yet, we're only halfway through the omnibus at this point, so you get a lot of aftermath, really. which is really good, because I think it's nice when you have an event like this, whatever it is, a big event. It's nice when it finishes to see what kind of lasting impact it has, and to get some, a decent amount of aftermath stories, which you definitely do in here. So really the main thing that happens is Bruce decides that even though he's beaten Azrael, even though he's back, he still doesn't feel right in just going straight back to being Batman. So he basically picks another replacement, this time Dick Grayson. Dick Grayson is Batman throughout this story called Prodigal, which runs through, I think, about 10 issues, like a 10-part story. And they make mention of the fact that, like, this time you've made the right choice. This is the person you should have picked to replace you all along. Which is probably what a lot of readers have been thinking previously at the time when they were reading through the whole Azrael stuff. Probably a lot of people, I can imagine, back then asking why it wasn't Nightwing. Surely he was the better choice than Jean-Paul Valley, the newcomer. But there you go, it happens here. So Bruce Wayne kind of goes away to sort of get his head together a bit, and you get this story with Dick Grayson as Batman working with Robin, and it's good. It's really cool. It's good to see a more sensible Batman. Somebody other than Bruce Wayne being Batman, but somebody far more enjoyable to read, obviously, than Azrael was. I mean, that's deliberate, but yeah, it's pretty good. And it makes for a lot of a much more interesting dynamic as well between Dick Grayson and Tim Drake. They have a quite interesting back and forth. They share a bit of banter. Obviously, Dick is a lot more chilled out than Bruce in general. He's not as uptight and serious as Bruce Wayne is all the time, so he makes for quite a different Batman. And I enjoyed it. I liked all of this. I really did. Just to kind of say again with Volume 2, as I said in my volume of that, my review, of that, that's the book that, of the three Omnis, Volume 2 is the one that I found to be the most of a slog to read through. It just kind of feels like that section of the story really drags on a bit longer than it needed to. With stuff in Volume 1 and then in here, you got a greater variety of things going on to keep it more interesting. So I really enjoyed this. I enjoyed Volume 1. I liked Volume 2 enough, don't get me wrong, I don't dislike it, I enjoy the whole thing, but Volumes 1 and 3, definitely the most interesting parts of the story for me. But this Prodigal story is not the end. This is part 11, so I think it's 12 parts. But it's not the last story that's collected in this book. Yeah, so this is the final. Yeah, so this is the final chapter of Prodigal. This is where Bruce Wayne returns kind of for real. So he's been away for, about 12 issues, and then he comes back. Reclaims the bat suit, takes it back from Nightwing. And then the last story that's in here is this one, Troika. Now this is interesting because it's where Kelly Jones, the guy who did the artwork for the dust covers for these three Omnis, actually started doing some interior artwork as well. And I tell you, he's got a very kind of classic Gothic style, sort of Gothic literary style. I mean, you can see this image here. That's an incredibly unique Batman. It's like a scary looking Batman. Very Gothic influence. Exaggerated features, these huge ears on the cowl. It's certainly a very unique style. I think the artwork he was drawing in here, back then, it's better than what he brought to the table with the covers for the Omnis when he came back and did those, whatever that was, 2-3 years ago, like 3 years ago. very interesting artwork, honestly. That's the part of this story that stood out to me the most. I actually can't really remember the plot of this Troika story so much. I think it's about like Batman's got to try and destroy some weapons of mass destruction or something that are being moved through Gotham or hidden in Gotham. I actually don't remember too much this final storyline. I think because I spent more time looking at the Kelly Jones artwork, focusing on that more so than the story. But anyway, what it is in the grander scheme of things is it's like this is now the official return of Batman. So he already came back once, he beat Azrael, then you had the bit with Dick Grayson as Batman. Now here, it's officially Bruce Wayne back, and this is kind of the beginning of the real post-Knightfall era, I suppose. Yeah, and then you get Alfred's return, which is like a one-shot story in here as well. So Alfred had left back in Volume 2. He had left Bruce Wayne because he was too frustrated at seeing Bruce kind of continually push himself harder and harder when he was, at that point, seriously injured. So here, Nightwing goes to London to track Alfred down and basically try and get him to come home, back to Gotham. But along the way, there's an adventure to be had here first. So it's like a Nightwing story, really. Nightwing and Alfred end up having to deal with some stuff that's going on in London before finally Alfred does in fact agree to go back to Gotham. Okay, yeah, and then the final story. Now this really bookends the entire thing. The first issue collected in Volume 1 was Vengeance of Bane, issue 1. So the very last issue in Volume 3, Vengeance of Bane, issue 2, part 2. And Bane had been largely absent from the whole thing because, back in Volume 1, obviously he's the main threat at the start of the whole Knightfall thing. He's the one who beats Batman, breaks Batman. But then Azrael defeated him, and after that, he's basically absent from the whole story up until the very end here. But it's a good inclusion because it kind of shows a bit of character growth for Bane. Back early on in the whole thing, he was quite single-mindedly obsessed with the idea of defeating Batman. He's not obsessed with Batman anymore as of this point. He's kind of got past that. And I think, in fact, in here there is a confrontation between Bane and Batman. I'm sure it's in here. Let's see if I can find it. It's a cool story though anyway. It's a nice way to end the whole thing. As I say, it really bookends the entire thing. Yeah, it's here. So this is the first time. So Batman and Bane, they come face to face in this scene. But they kind of decide, there's more going on than just having a rematch. And Bane's not all about that anymore anyway. So yeah, then you get, afterward, a few extras in the back. And the final bookend page. So there we go. That's Volume 3. We've now covered the whole Knightfall Saga on here. One of the most, you could say, famous, important stories in Batman's history. Certainly a very long one. It runs through 3 massive books here, collecting the entire thing. So yeah, it's a huge storyline really to read. And hopefully in these reviews, if you've seen all 3 of them, you've enjoyed them, found at least some of what I've had to say enjoyable or insightful, whether it's about the storyline or just the specific omnibus. This volume, I think, Volume 3, is the one that's at the moment hardest to get. I think Volumes 1 and 2 are still in print, although maybe getting hard to find. This one, as far as I understand it, is the one that's really tough to find at the moment. Hopefully DC we'll bring these back into print at some point, because at the end of the day, I know it's not one of the absolute greatest stories, but I think it's certainly one of the most iconic when it comes to Batman. No doubt, you know, whether or not you agree with that, though, that's obviously up to you, and I'm always happy to chat about these things. So if you want to leave a comment below and let me know what you think of this book, the Knightfall Saga as a whole, happy to hear your thoughts. If you could put a like on the video, it's a nice way to show a bit of support, and I really do appreciate that, guys. Any support that you can give me is very much appreciated, and I thank you for it. But as always, thank you for watching this video today, and I'll be back again soon and discuss something else.